The scripture text for today is from Mark chapter 10, verses 1 to 12, and you'll find it at the very back of the bulletin. And he left there and went to the region of Judea and beyond the Jordan, and crowds gathered to him again, and again, as his custom was, he taught them. And Pharisees came up, and in order to test him, asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" He answered them, "What did Moses command you?" And they said, "Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce and to put her away." But Jesus said to them, "For your hardness of heart he wrote you this commandment. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one. So they are no longer two, but one. What therefore God has joined together, let not man put asunder." And in the house the disciples asked him again about this matter. And he said to them, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery." The word of the Lord. Turn it the other way. Oh, thanks.
Well, welcome. Welcome. We're walking with Jesus now toward Jerusalem. And it's a distinct phase of this man's ministry in chapters 9 and 10 of this gospel that we're reading. Mark describes Jesus' physical journey with his disciples to Jerusalem. But because he is teacher, it's also a spiritual journey for them. He's bringing his disciples on a spiritual journey, really to prepare them spiritually for Jerusalem. And the heart of this journey is the meaning of Christ. What that word Christ means. In many different ways, through sundry issues, he's teaching them this same thing over and over. Jesus was on a mission. He keeps telling them that they're going to Jerusalem for him to die. And all these widely separated topics of instruction that we were reading through in these two chapters, they funnel into the meaning of that mission. Even this passage that we're reading today. There's a word in verse 1 for that word for as his custom was. It's eoda. It means as is customary, as his custom was, as it's translated there. It's kind of funny coincidence because it's from that Greek word that we get our word ethics. It doesn't really mean anything except it's kind of a funny coincidence here because he's teaching them ethics. And it's something they customarily did, is to teach ethics to the folks who were traveling with him and gathered around him. He addressed issues of larger society. So if you have a view of Christ that doesn't include that only has him concerned with kind of private spirituality and giving comfort to individuals, then you're missing something about Christ. That's an erroneous view. He shows himself here to be concerned with teaching about ethical issues that impact the larger culture. And verse 1 here, we see him entering Judea. Okay, this is big time. And it seems to me that by the teaching that takes place in this chapter, that the people on this part of the journey, this part of the country, are much more engaged with cultural issues, with larger issues of society. So this comes up. Now, the debate of this passage about divorce is 2,000 years later, still occurring in our very lives. Is it not just this week? Judith Kay, Chief Judge of New York, praised a report calling for no-fault divorce in our state. She said that no-fault divorces would mean that spouses, quote, don't have to invent charges against each other, unquote. So what she's looking at there are the ways that these things develop, very is very convoluted, these divorces, and the way that people start to treat each other in a trial, in a court trial. And she's finding fault with that, but she wants to somehow streamline the process, to give someone an ability to divorce a spouse with really very little or no grounds whatsoever. She says, quote, "Currently, divorce takes much too long and costs much too much money, too much agony, too hard on the children," unquote. So she wants to make divorce easier. It's a very difficult subject to broach, because you streamline divorce, you're going to have more divorces. What strikes me is that it's a hot social topic about what should constitute grounds for divorce and how easy it should be is nothing new. Here in verse 2, we see that divorce was, even then, it was a hot topic. It's this subject that the Pharisees think they can use to trip Jesus up. Why? Because it was controversial. You know, some rabbis of that time period, like Hillel, it's early, end part of the 1st century BC, beginning of the 1st century AD, Rabbi Hillel taught about this, and another rabbi, Joshua ben Sirah, from about 200 BC, they were kind of on the lax side. The Rabbi Ben Sirah taught that a man could divorce his wife for being annoying or for burning his dinner, so long as he gave her a certificate of divorce, so long as he fulfilled that obligation. Other rabbis, such as Rabbi Shammai, taught that divorce could only be legitimate for adultery. But actually, as we'll see, the kind of consensus of the time was on the lax side, on not needing to do too much to be able to carry through a divorce. So this was a controversial subject, but not only a controversial subject, it was a dangerous subject. Because they weren't too far now as they're traveling south from where John the Baptist had conducted his ministry. They were going south to the region, it says there, called Perea, say, beyond Jordan. And beyond Jordan is where John the Baptist is described to have baptized. And John, we may recall, as Mark told us early in this gospel, was beheaded over this very issue of divorce and remarriage. That is, his teaching about it offended Herodias, not stepping outside of the Jewish culture into the larger Roman culture, public figure, political figure, Herodias, who had divorced Philip, her husband, and then married Herod Antipas, right in this area. And John's position on this led to his execution. And so here they are coming into the same geographical region. So this was not only a controversial subject in these parts, it was a dangerous subject. So it was a cunning move by the Pharisees to see if Jesus could hang himself on this topic. So let's see if Jesus can get himself into trouble. So the Pharisees are thinking, very cunning. So Jesus does ethics. What we see him in this passage doing is ethics, doing ethical thinking for large-scale issues. And he asked the Pharisees the question, well, what did Moses say? You're asking me? What did Moses teach about this? In verse 4, Pharisees say, well, he talked about giving him a certificate of divorce. They're referring to a law, Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 3, saying, well, Moses permitted people to get a divorce if they gave a certificate of divorce. You can go back and read it. It's actually a very confusing Hebrew sentence. It's a long Hebrew sentence, 3 verses. And they were interpreting it to condone divorce. You can go back and read it. If you read it, you can see the principle is really about Moses trying to protect women from being defiled in various ways. And so he brings up divorce, but it raises the question whether Moses actually allowed it. There are other laws that mention divorced people. A priest could not marry a divorced woman, it was said. So did that mean that Moses was allowing divorce as a regular pattern, a regular practice in the society of Israel? Is that what was going on? And Jesus takes this question and answers that, no, you've misunderstood. Moses tolerated divorce, he said. He didn't authorize it, didn't sanction it. It was neither commanded nor condoned in the passage that they quote. It's kind of like if you have a law that kind of regulates murder. You know, the current laws do that. You wouldn't say, well, there's a tacit approval of murder in that law just because it's trying to control a situation that's there. No, Jesus said, this is a law that was given because of hardness of hearts. And you know, much of the Old Testament law falls in this category of making this kind of provision for hard hearts. Jesus says that Moses wrote it for that reason. So when we take a view of this, it helps us to understand that certain things written in the law are not kind of set in stone, so to speak, but they're there to help coach the Israelites into a new way of life from their old life and the things that they were doing. Coaching law. So then Jesus goes on about this, and please note, he doesn't escape his entrappers by equivocating. This is typical. You know, Jesus gets these traps laid in front of him. He doesn't avoid them by sitting on a fence. Instead, what he often does is speak something that rings in people's ears because it goes underneath the trap to truth. And it makes people forget what the trap was to begin with because what he's saying is just ringing in their ears. Oh, there's such clarity there. So you notice here he's quite definite about divorce. What does he do? He acknowledges the law. He says, yes, you got to get the mind of God through Moses here. But the problem with you Pharisees, the problem is that you don't go far enough into Moses. So you didn't take into account all of Moses' teaching in order to understand this law, this one law in Deuteronomy 24. In fact, he says the real truth of Moses and Moses' teaching on marriage and divorce, for that you have to go even farther back into Genesis. And so he says you got to look at all of what Moses teaches in order to understand what he's really trying to get at here. And so, in a sense, he's saying you have to understand marriage first in order to understand divorce. To see what marriage is. What are the matters of marriage? And that's what he goes on to talk about. So I'd like to take a little while to look at Jesus' teaching here on marriage in verses 6 through 9. And he asks the question, what matters in marriage? And I think we find two principles in here, two matters in marriage. One is in verses 6 through 7, and the other in verses 8 through 9. Okay? Neither of them are all that popular. Maybe God is sparing me this morning with this snowstorm so that we can limit the controversy. I don't know, you know. I think about those things, God's sovereignty. But the two principles that he brings up here that I see are gender and permanence. Gender and permanence. Let's talk about those. First in verses 6 through 7. Now, I know this is not popular. It's not popular to pay attention to gender in marriage. Because marriage today is supposed to be just symmetrical, right? In fact, increasingly, many feel that it doesn't even matter if there are different genders involved in the marriage. But what we see here and what Jesus is teaching, to Jesus, gender does matter. And he goes out of his way, one of the ways you can see that is how he goes out of his way to bring together two scriptures from different places. He's actually, it might look like he's making one quotation here. He's actually making two quotations. In answering this question about what marriage is for, first he quotes Genesis 1:27. It says, God created that man in his own image. Male and female created he them. And then he jumps a chapter and quotes Genesis 2:24. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. So now why start in Genesis 1:27 if the whole point were right there in Genesis 2? Why would he jump a chapter? Why would he bring these two together? Because if gender was insignificant to marriage, he could have just started there with the second quotation from chapter 2. But gender is significant to the meaning of marriage. Hence, he says, therefore two people get married. And in fact, Jesus is using a shorthand here because the second verse he quotes follows a story about gender in chapter 2. So by making the therefore, when he says therefore, this is why two people come together, to refer to Genesis 1:27 as he does, he's really respecting the meaning of the original text. But he's just saying it succinctly. He's just saying, instead of telling you the whole story about gender here, I'm going to use the earlier chapter's summary statement that God created these genders, and then he brings them together in a marriage. This is important to his teaching about marriage. Now, a lot of times we don't see that today, and I just want to say, I want to acknowledge that in a genderless marriage, it's a marriage where gender is downplayed, or it's even done away with. There can be good things. There may be care. There may be concern. There may be companionship. Sure, of course. There may be many helpful things in these relationships. In any relationship. There may be love. Sure. But Jesus is teaching that love, quote unquote, as it's commonly understood, does not a full marriage make. Or maybe he would say it this way. Perhaps he would put it this way. I don't get a full love in a genderless marriage. But if what Jesus says is true, then ultimately a genderless marriage is boring. For example, there may be a physical intimacy, a certain amount of satisfaction. You might get a certain amount of pleasure, but you'll never get how shall I put it? You'll never reach the heights you could. And that's why, in a bedroom, you find is a place where people slip back into gender roles. It's like doing the bump. Remember that dance, the bump? How many remember that? How many remember? Not too many hands. Do you know why you don't remember that dance? Because it was boring. Did you remember that? It was a unisex dance, and don't demonstrate, yeah. Don't try to demonstrate. Why don't you remember that? There was a certain amount, you couldn't go places with it. It had a limited idea as a dance. I was thinking about demonstrating this with my wife. And my teenage son said, Dad, you're a pastor. You can't do anything you want. So I told him, well, thanks for the counsel, son. I thought it's supposed to go the other direction, but anyway, this may be the reason why, friends, that one of the last bastions of our culture that affirm gender is formal dancing. And it's a real controversy. And it's kind of surprising because formal dancing is a place where folks who want to do away with gender, you find a lot of them there. And yet it's a real point of controversy now about whether same-sex couples are going to be allowed to enter into competitions. The formal dance culture is really resisting. Why? Well, it limits the ideas of the dance. So Jesus' teaching here is that there's an asymmetry in a marriage relationship, that a gendered marriage actually makes a fuller-bodied and so less limited relationship of intimacy. And there's a way that a husband and wife behave toward one another that's different. And he doesn't go into it. We don't have a lot of time to go into it here, but just to put it this way, there's a determined dying to oneself in the husband and a corresponding surrender of prerogative in the wife. There's a proactivity in the husband for the wife's benefit, and a corresponding filling in of what the husband lacks in the wife. You could go on different ways that plays out, but gender matters, simply put. Now, he's certainly teaching along with this that there is a symmetry also in certain aspects of marriage that are born of the sexes' equality before God. And you can see that in the various ways in this passage, how he wants to assert also at the same time the equality of the different genders. He says, you could see it in verse 11, actually, contrary to the rabbinic teaching of the time, which seemed to hold that adultery was only an offense that could be committed against God or against another man. Jesus asserts that this could be an offense against the wife. It's unconventional for that time for him to say that. And you see in verse 12 also, the way he puts it, he says it both ways to create a symmetry here of offense and divorce. He says the one divorcing is wronging the other, whether it's man or woman. Creates a symmetry there. So in both these ways, Jesus is elevating the status of the wife to the level of the husband. Okay, it's another instance of how Christianity raised the status of women in the world. So we want to celebrate, along with Jesus, the equality of the genders, because those things flow right out of the biblical understanding of men and women, full equality before God. He created them male and female, both in God's image. But there's also an asymmetry that he's also bringing forth. And that's why virtually all of the New Testament instruction on marriage is gender intense. Go to find instruction in the New Testament about marriage, you come to gender. So gender matters. That's the first thing. He says, secondly, number 2 principle, verses 8 through 9 about marriage, is its permanence. Permanence matters in marriage. Or as Jesus puts it in verse 8, a man and a woman become one flesh. A husband and wife become one unit in a mysterious way, mysterious ways. And even when he uses this word cleave, when the scripture says that a man shall cleave to his wife, it's using a covenantal term. It's used elsewhere to express the way the Israelites were to cleave with a continual loyalty to the Lord. What he's saying here is that the genders come together and the genders lock. And there's no key to unlock this lock. It's an unopenable lock. It's like those child window guards in the upper floors of a New York City apartment. Okay, once you install those, there's no way to uninstall them. Okay, there's no screwdriver you can get to uninstall the child gate. Those window guards there. It's the same thing. Verse 9, Jesus puts it in a beautiful way. He says, he encourages us to understand our marriages as something God has ordained. That God is pleased to have made these. And we might think it was our idea, but Jesus is saying, no, don't look at it that way. Look at it as it was God's idea. And that lends, you see, a permanence to the operation. Now, I know in saying this to some of us, especially those of us with a divorce in our past or to those with a real messed up marriage, we are not untouched by these types of tragedies at the Village Church. In saying this, I know these words don't carry a beauty, but a harshness. Especially in light of kind of an opposite cultural attitude. Jesus sounds not only too strict, but needlessly harsh. And just like Jesus was telling the Pharisees to do with Moses, we need to do with Jesus as well. And when we take all of Jesus' teaching together, not just here, we find that there are grounds to recognize that sometimes a marriage has been broken and one of the parties is no longer bound. And in that case, a permitting of remarriage. There are when you take Jesus' different teachings all together, we see that there are grounds at times to understand that a marriage has been broken. But Mark doesn't mention them here in recording Jesus' discourse here because they're extreme. And he wouldn't distract from the main teaching. But acknowledging these, even acknowledging that there are times, sometimes, and we need to acknowledge it's gone. It's a far cry from the irreconcilable differences clause of most contemporary divorce legislation, or the practice of divorcing in order to make room for another woman or another man. Yeah? I mean, one commentator put it of Jesus here, no one else in antiquity spoke of divorce in such strong terms. Jesus was speaking in strong terms here, and you can tell by the disciples' reaction, can't you? You know, there's this public pattern that we see through the Gospel of Mark of public preaching where Jesus preaches, and then there's a private consultation with the disciples. You know, we see that repeated a number of times. In fact, you see there are times Jesus is obviously speaking to a crowd, and then it says, and afterward in the house, and I come across it and say, what house? Where did the house come from? But apparently, you know, there's this repeated pattern of him preaching, and then the disciples get a private conference to talk to him about what he said. And in this case, happens again. And in the house, what did the disciples ask? You know, look that was a pretty clear answer in verses 5 through 9, don't you think? Don't you think Jesus made it pretty clear what his position was? And yet, when they get inside, they want to hear it again. What they're saying to him is, are you really saying that? In fact, if you read this in the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew brings out their shock rather explicitly. They were shocked at this teaching. And Jewish sources confirm that, you know, it's because, in their minds, a divorce was relatively easy to obtain. So Jesus' stance on the permanence of marriage was surprising even to his disciples. The gender and permanence matter in marriage. And friends, I'm afraid that we find that no amount of restating or recasting this to try to make people feel like it's not a big deal is going to take away the real trauma that a divorce causes. The trauma, and those of you who've kind of been up close against one, you know it's not just to the two partners involved. You know, I have to say it, superb movie, The Squid and the Whale. A superb but painful movie to watch. Superb because of the director's and writer's insight into the marriage relationship. The Squid and the Whale. There comes this one scene where this Park Slope couple, it's placed in Park Slope, takes place in Park Slope, could easily be Greenwich Village. This kind of couple where the parents are breaking up. They sit the kids down. There's two sons, an older son and a younger son, to explain what's going on. And naturally, they try to say, it's not a big deal. You know, we're still both going to be in your lives. You're going to see this person. You're going to see that person on that day. They're just trying to make it, you know, like it's not such a big deal. And what happens? The younger son just bursts into tears. And the older son blows up at them. He just gets so mad at them. It's just very real reactions to this kind of situation. And the parents apparently are unprepared for this kind of reaction. They thought they were going to be able to smooth it over pretty well. And so the mother, this is the classic line from the movie, this Park Slope mother looks at the sons and says, but wait a minute. Aren't most of your friends' parents divorced? Haven't most of your friends' parents had a divorce? And the son says, well, yeah, but not mine. In other words, it's tragic comedy here. The son has to say, well, yeah, that's true. Most of my friends' parents are divorced, but that doesn't take away from the trauma of actually having it happen to me. So, friends, it creates trauma to break this permanence of marriage. And that's why, we here at the Village Church are doing all that we can to create healthy marriages. Maybe you've picked that up. Maybe you've kind of heard that, if you go through engagement counseling here, it's a big deal. And it's true. My wife and I make a very high priority of giving you time and our attention. For this reason, some people might think it's just overkill. We give these multiple sessions. But we do it because, I don't know, maybe you've never walked through a divorce with someone that you love. Or maybe you haven't ever taken these words of Jesus so seriously. But we do. Another thing that we're going to be doing along these lines, the reason we have this emphasis is create a class for you. We're going to have an adult Sunday school class. It's going to start in a few weeks on the mystery of marriage. 5 or 6 week class. We're going to go through the topics. And the Christian Education Department of the Village Church is working very hard to make this a class that's going to be useful to you. Whether you are married, for those of you who are building a marriage now, or whether you are going to in the future, or maybe how to look for someone with whom to build this marriage with. We're designing it for all those folks in mind. It's going to be starting just a few weeks in April. So we have this emphasis here in this church. Why? Well, there's a deeper reason. There's a deeper reason why we put this emphasis on marriage here. Besides wanting to do everything we can to help your marriages or marriages to be, there's another reason why the Village Church and Jesus have this emphasis. Is this incident that comes up here demonstrates proper exegesis to us, as well as how to think ethically about marriage. But it also had a deeper point. It might sound like a teaching on ethics, but it's really just another way of saying to them, his disciples, we are going to Jerusalem for me to die for you. What do I mean? I mean, Jesus was explaining this to explain the constancy of love. The absolute commitment of marriage proclaimed his commitment to them and the reason he was going to Jerusalem, to die for them. In Jerusalem, God would join together a Savior and his people, which man would not be able to put asunder. You know, I don't relish this. I don't like teaching on controversial topics. I don't kind of get a high from this, like a big thrill. I don't like to preach on issues that distract from the gospel of Jesus Christ. But I'm preaching on this topic because it does affect the gospel, or rather, the gospel affects it. Our condition is, as Moses found, hardness in our hearts. And it wasn't just the Israelites' hearts, friends, it's the human heart. And so Moses confronted with this hardness of heart, whereas Moses could only make laws that accommodated our hard hearts, made provision for our hard hearts. Jesus did something much greater than Moses ever could. Jesus made love to our hard hearts. He made love to our hard hearts, in fact, in these very two marriage principles that he was teaching. Because his love led. He stood up and did what was needed to be done to take care of the mess. You see him on this road to Jerusalem. He's walking ahead of the disciples. You go on to read, you'll see it. He's walking ahead of the disciples while they're hanging back. But he's doing it for them. He's doing what he needed to do to go to the cross for them, to die to his own way in order to bring them along with him. That's why Jesus, gender matters in marriage. Genderly, properly expressed in a husband, commemorates that willingness to initiate in love. And then there's a response. Who are his people? His bride. Those who have surrendered the prerogative of their lives to him in a much bigger way than a bride does in a marriage. And secondly, his death is there to show that his love for his bride would last forever. Oh, love that will not let me go. Oh, love that nothing on earth can put asunder. Now there's a Valentine. That's a Valentine for you to receive and celebrate this week. If you don't have a date, whether you have a date this week or not, there's a Valentine for you. See, what he's trying to say through this teaching on marriage is something that he's trying to say to his church. So, you know what? This puts us in a position to really understand then what divorce ruins. You know what divorce really ruins? It doesn't just ruin a relationship, friends. It ruins the ability of people to recognize what Jesus Christ promises. You see how it's expressed in verse 11? The way it's phrased, the divorcing husband is actually doing something against her. He's doing something against her. What is it? He's taking away her ability to believe that there is a love like this. In a culture that increasingly accepts and supports divorce, and one that increasingly minimizes the reality of gender, will cripple the ability of people to affirm Christ's undying love for his church. What does divorce really ruin? Divorce ruins the picture that Jesus Christ died to present, that God's commitment to his people is unassailable, that there is a love that would do anything to address the need of the beloved, that no matter what the difficulties, he will do whatever it takes to preserve the place of his bride. And the bride will respond in breathtaking trust. That's gender. That's permanence. Divorce ruins the very same thing that a strong marriage makes it much easier to believe. That there is love. Amen. Would you stand with me?